Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of the most extraordinary stories of faith, courage, and unwavering integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure to compromise. We're exploring the life of Daniel, a young man who was torn from everything familiar and thrust into the heart of the most powerful empire on earth, yet never forgot who he truly was or whom he served. This is a story about standing firm when everything around you demands that you bend, about maintaining your identity when forces beyond your control try to reshape you into something else entirely. It's about discovering that faith isn't just what you believe when life is comfortable, but what you choose when that faith is tested by fire. Daniel's journey shows us that unshakable faith often begins with seemingly small decisions that prepare us for the greater tests that lie ahead. So without further ado, let's begin. The year was 605 BC, and the ancient world was convulsing with the birth pangs of a new empire that would reshape the map of civilization. From the ziggurats of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar II gazed eastward toward the small kingdom of Judah with the calculating eyes of a conqueror who understood that true victory required more than military conquest. It demanded the systematic dismantling of everything that made a people distinct and proud. The Babylonian war machine that rolled toward Jerusalem was unlike anything the world had ever seen. This was not merely an army, but a carefully orchestrated instrument of imperial policy, designed not just to defeat enemies but to absorb them so completely that resistance would become not only futile, but literally unthinkable. The soldiers who marched in perfect formation carried weapons forged from the finest bronze and iron, while their siege engines represented engineering marvels that could reduce the strongest fortifications to rubble. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the methodical precision with which Nebuchadnezzar implemented his strategy of cultural annihilation. Where previous conquerors had been content to demand tribute and nominal submission, the Babylonian king understood that lasting empire required the complete transformation of conquered peoples into loyal subjects who would serve not from fear, but from genuine identification with their new masters. The kingdom of Judah that found itself in Babylon's crosshairs was a shadow of the mighty realm that David and Solomon had once ruled. Centuries of political division, military defeats, and spiritual compromise had reduced the descendants of Abraham to a small, vulnerable state caught between the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Yet something of their ancient identity still burned within them, a memory of covenant relationship with the God of Israel that made them dangerous to any empire that demanded absolute loyalty. King Jehoiakim of Judah had made the fatal mistake of rebelling against Babylonian authority, encouraged by promises of Egyptian support that proved as substantial as morning mist when Nebuchadnezzar's armies actually appeared on the horizon. The siege of Jerusalem that followed was brutal but brief, a demonstration of Babylonian military superiority that left no doubt about the futility of further resistance. The terms of surrender that Nebuchadnezzar imposed on the defeated kingdom revealed the sophisticated nature of his imperial strategy. Rather than simply looting the temple treasury and withdrawing, the Babylonian king carefully selected specific items that would serve his purposes in the complex psychological warfare he was about to wage against Jewish identity. The golden vessels that had been crafted for worship in Solomon's temple were carried away not merely as trophies, but as symbols of the impotence of the God who had failed to protect his people. But it was Nebuchadnezzar's treatment of the human population that revealed the true genius of his approach to empire building. Instead of the mass deportations that had characterized earlier conquests, the Babylonian king implemented a carefully calibrated program of selective exile that would remove potential leaders while leaving enough population to maintain economic productivity. This was demographic engineering on a scale that would not be seen again until the modern era. The royal decree that sealed the fate of Jerusalem's nobility was precise in its cruelty and brilliant in its strategic implications. Bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, Nebuchadnezzar commanded his chief official, outlining requirements that would ensure he captured the very best of Jewish society. Young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace. The criteria for selection revealed Nebuchadnezzar's understanding that the most dangerous enemies of empire were not the strong and rebellious, but the intelligent and capable. By removing the most promising young men from Jewish society, he was simultaneously strengthening his own administration and ensuring that any future resistance would lack the leadership necessary for success. Among those selected for this forced honour was a teenager whose Hebrew name, Daniel, proclaimed a truth that would prove more durable than all the power of Babylon: God is my judge. The young man who bore this name came from a family of such prominence that he was likely related to the royal house of David itself, heir to centuries of tradition that connected him to the greatest moments in his people's history. Daniel's three companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were similarly chosen for their exceptional qualities and noble birth. Their names too carried theological weight that proclaimed their family's commitment to the God of Israel. Hananiah meant the Lord shows grace. Mishael declared, "Who is what God is?" And Azariah proclaimed, "The Lord helps." Together, these four young men embodied the finest achievements of Jewish culture and education. The journey from Jerusalem to Babylon was a forced march of nearly 600 miles that served as the first phase of their systematic transformation from Jewish nobles into Babylonian servants. The route itself was carefully chosen to demonstrate Babylonian power and sophistication, while simultaneously overwhelming the captives with the magnitude of the empire they were entering. They passed through cities whose ancient names were legend, crossed rivers that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and observed firsthand the engineering marvels that made Babylonian dominance seem as natural and inevitable as the rising sun. Babylon itself was a sight that left even the most sophisticated visitors speechless with wonder and intimidation. The city rose from the Mesopotamian plain like a man-made mountain, its massive walls stretching for miles around an urban complex that housed over 1 million inhabitants. The famous Hanging Gardens, constructed by Nebuchadnezzar for his homesick queen, created an artificial paradise that seemed to demonstrate humanity's ability to improve upon divine creation itself. The ziggurats that dominated the city's skyline were more than architectural achievements. They were theological statements that proclaimed Babylonian gods superior to any deities that lesser peoples might worship. The Tower of Babel, rebuilt and expanded under successive Babylonian kings, reached toward heaven with a defiance that seemed to mock the very concept of divine authority over human affairs. But it was the royal palace complex that truly captured the imagination and overwhelmed the senses of new arrivals. Covering hundreds of acres and employing thousands of servants, officials, and guards, the palace was a city within a city where the business of governing the known world was conducted with efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The throne room alone was larger than most temples, its ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to suggest the king's authority extended beyond earthly realms into the very heavens themselves. Into this environment of overwhelming power and sophistication, Daniel and his friends were introduced as raw material for a transformation process that had proven remarkably successful in converting conquered nobility into loyal imperial servants. The Babylonian educational system was the most advanced in the ancient world, a 3-year program that combined intellectual instruction with cultural immersion in ways designed to completely reshape a student's identity and loyalties. The curriculum itself was encyclopedic in scope, covering everything from mathematics and astronomy to literature and statecraft. Students learned the cuneiform writing system that allowed them to access the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization, studied the religious traditions that justified Babylonian rule, and mastered the diplomatic protocols that governed relationships between the empire and its various subject peoples. But perhaps most importantly, they were immersed in a worldview that made Babylonian dominance seem not only natural, but divinely ordained. The creation myths that they studied portrayed Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, as the supreme deity who had brought order out of cosmic chaos. The historical chronicles they memorized presented Babylonian kings as agents of divine will, chosen by the gods to rule over lesser peoples for their own benefit. The psychological pressure to conform was immense and carefully calculated. These young men were cut off from everything familiar: their families, their homeland, their religious community, their cultural traditions. In place of these severed connections, they were offered new relationships, new opportunities, and new identities that promised advancement and success beyond anything they could have achieved in their conquered homeland. The first and most visible symbol of this transformation was the assignment of new names that would replace their Hebrew identities with Babylonian alternatives. Daniel became Belteshazzar, a name that honoured Bel, the patron deity of Babylon, and declared that this god would protect his life. Hananiah was renamed Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego, each new name serving as a daily reminder that their old identities had been erased and replaced with new ones more suitable to their imperial service. But names were only the beginning of a comprehensive program designed to reshape every aspect of their existence. They were housed in quarters that provided luxury beyond anything most palace servants could expect, dressed in clothing that marked them as members of the royal court, and given access to teachers whose knowledge was considered the finest in the known world. Most significantly of all, they were assigned a daily portion from the king's own table, food and wine that had been specially prepared for royal consumption, and carried with it all the symbolic weight of sharing in the king's own substance and authority. This was not merely sustenance, but a form of communion that would bind them to their new master and gradually erode any remaining loyalty to their former identity. It was at this crucial juncture that Daniel made a decision that would define not only his own destiny, but the fate of his 3 friends and ultimately the course of empires. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's food or with the wine which he drank, the ancient chroniclers recorded, noting the quiet determination that would prove more powerful than all the might of Babylon. The decision was both practical and profoundly theological. From a practical standpoint, the king's food had almost certainly been offered to Babylonian gods as part of the preparation process, making consumption of it tantamount to participation in pagan worship. From a theological perspective, accepting the king's food would represent submission to an authority system that denied the sovereignty of the God of Israel. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel understood that this seemingly small decision was actually a test of everything he claimed to believe about identity, loyalty, and the source of ultimate authority in the universe. The young man who had been torn from his homeland and thrust into an alien culture was being offered a choice between comfort and conviction, between advancement and integrity, between a new identity that promised success and an old identity that guaranteed conflict. The approach that Daniel took to this crisis revealed both wisdom beyond his years and faith that had been tested and proven genuine. Rather than making his refusal a public confrontation that would force palace officials to choose between their own safety and his principles, he sought a private meeting with the chief official responsible for his care and presented his request in terms that appealed to practical concerns rather than religious sensibilities. "Please test your servants for 10 days, Daniel proposed, his words carefully chosen to minimize threat while maximizing the possibility of accommodation. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's food, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants." The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity and shrewd in its psychology. By framing his request as a test rather than a demand, Daniel removed the element of challenge to royal authority, while providing the official with objective criteria for evaluation. By limiting the trial period to 10 days, he made the risk seem manageable, while trusting that God would honour his faithfulness by providing visible proof of divine blessing. The chief official's agreement to this proposal was itself a minor miracle that revealed how God was already beginning to work behind the scenes to honour Daniel's commitment to faithfulness. The man whose responsibility it was to ensure that these young nobles were successfully integrated into Babylonian court culture found himself willing to risk his own position to accommodate the religious sensibilities of a teenage captive. The 10 days that followed were a crucial period of testing that would determine whether Daniel's faith was merely sentimental attachment to familiar customs or genuine trust in the power of the God who had allowed his people to be conquered and exiled. Each morning brought a choice between the rich foods that his companions in the royal program enjoyed and the simple vegetables and water that his principles demanded. But the test involved far more than dietary restrictions. Daniel and his friends were also required to excel in their studies, while maintaining the energy and alertness necessary to compete with classmates who enjoyed every advantage that Babylonian wealth and sophistication could provide. They were proving not only that obedience to God was possible in a pagan environment, but that such obedience actually enhanced, rather than hindered, their ability to serve effectively. The results of the test exceeded everyone's expectations and provided undeniable evidence that divine blessing was resting upon these young men in ways that transcended natural explanation. At the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies, the court records noted, documenting a transformation that could only be attributed to supernatural intervention. But physical appearance was only the most visible manifestation of divine favour that was being poured out upon Daniel and his friends. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, the chroniclers recorded, noting how their academic performance surpassed that of students who had enjoyed every educational advantage. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. The special gift of dream interpretation that God granted to Daniel would prove crucial in the events that lay ahead. But for now, it served as a sign that the God of Israel was not only present in Babylon, but was actively preparing his servants for roles that would demonstrate his power before the greatest empire on earth. The 3 years of education that followed the dietary test became a period of intensive preparation, during which Daniel and his friends mastered every aspect of Babylonian culture while maintaining their commitment to the God who'd sustained them through their initial crisis. They learned to read and write in the cuneiform script that recorded the wisdom of millennia, studied the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that made Babylonian science the wonder of the ancient world, and absorbed the political and diplomatic skills that would make them valuable servants of the imperial administration. Yet throughout this period of intensive acculturation, they never forgot the lesson they had learned during their first test, that faithfulness to God was not only compatible with excellence in secular pursuits, but actually enhanced their ability to succeed in whatever circumstances divine providence placed them. The young men who had refused the king's food proved to be the most capable students in their class, demonstrating that obedience to divine authority created rather than hindered human achievement. The final examination that concluded their educational program provided an opportunity for Daniel and his friends to demonstrate publicly what they had been proving privately throughout their 3 years of study. When King Nebuchadnezzar himself interviewed the graduating class, seeking to identify the most promising candidates for important positions within his administration, the 4 young Hebrews stood out with a clarity that amazed even the king. In all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, the official records noted, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. The comparison was particularly significant because it placed these teenage captives above the most learned and experienced advisors in the entire Babylonian Empire. But perhaps most remarkably of all, this extraordinary achievement was accomplished while Daniel and his friends maintained their Hebrew identity and their commitment to the God of Israel. The young men who had been renamed with Babylonian titles never forgot their true names or their ultimate loyalty. The students who mastered Babylonian literature never confused their academic success with spiritual compromise. The positions that Daniel and his friends received within the imperial administration represented the culmination of Nebuchadnezzar's strategy for converting conquered nobility into loyal servants. Yet the reality was quite different from what the king had intended. Instead of creating Babylonian officials who happened to have Hebrew backgrounds, he had produced Hebrew servants of God who were strategically positioned within the highest levels of imperial authority. The stage was set for a series of confrontations that would test whether the faith that had sustained these young men through the challenges of education and cultural assimilation would prove sufficient for the far greater trials that lay ahead. The God who had honoured their faithfulness in the matter of food and learning was preparing them for tests that would require not just personal integrity, but courage that bordered on the superhuman. The 4 young men who had been torn from their homeland as symbols of Judah's defeat were about to become instruments through which the God of Israel would demonstrate his sovereignty over the greatest empire on earth. The faith that had rooted itself in seemingly small decisions about diet and study habits was about to be tested by fires that would either consume their convictions or prove them to be as unshakable as the eternal purposes of the God they served. In the magnificent palaces of Babylon, where human power seemed absolute and divine authority appeared irrelevant, these young exiles were about to discover that their faith had been preparing them for a destiny far greater than anything they could have imagined. The test that lay ahead would reveal whether their commitment to the God of their fathers was merely the nostalgic attachment of homesick refugees, or the genuine foundation upon which empires could be shaken and the course of history itself could be altered. In the second year of his reign, when the palace of Babylon should have echoed with the confident sounds of imperial administration and royal celebration, King Nebuchadnezzar found himself tormented by dreams that robbed him of sleep and filled his waking hours with an anxiety that no amount of wealth or power could dispel. The monarch who commanded absolute obedience from millions of subjects discovered that his own mind had become a battlefield where mysterious visions waged war against his peace of mind with relentless persistence. The dreams themselves came with a vividness and intensity that distinguished them from the normal products of an overactive imagination or the tensions of rulership. These were not the scattered, illogical fragments that typically dissolve upon waking, but coherent, powerful visions that burn themselves into the king's consciousness with the clarity of waking experiences. Night after night, the same images returned with such force that Nebuchadnezzar began to dread the very act of falling asleep. Yet what tormented the king most was not simply the recurring nature of these dreams, but his complete inability to retain their specific content upon awakening. The visions that seemed so vivid and meaningful in sleep vanished like morning mist when he opened his eyes, leaving behind only a profound sense of urgency and the maddening certainty that he had been shown something of tremendous significance that now lay beyond his grasp. In the sophisticated culture of ancient Babylon, dreams were not dismissed as mere psychological phenomena, but were understood to be one of the primary means through which the gods communicated with mortals. The interpretation of dreams was a highly developed science that required years of training and access to extensive libraries of symbolic meanings that had been compiled over centuries of careful observation and analysis. The royal summons that went out to all the wise men of Babylon carried an urgency that set the entire intellectual establishment of the empire on edge. Magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans, representatives of every school of wisdom that Babylonian civilization had produced, were commanded to appear before the king immediately to address a crisis that threatened to undermine the very foundations of royal authority. The assembly that gathered in the throne room represented the accumulated wisdom of the most sophisticated civilization on earth. These were men who had spent their entire careers studying the movements of stars, the patterns of bird flight, the configurations of sheep livers, and every other means through which divine will was believed to manifest itself in the natural world. Their libraries contained thousands of tablets recording the symbolic meanings of every conceivable dream image. Their mathematical calculations could predict eclipses and planetary movements with astonishing accuracy, and their reputation for wisdom extended throughout the known world. But when King Nebuchadnezzar presented his request to this assembly of the empire's greatest minds, their confidence evaporated like water thrown onto hot stones. "O king, live forever," they responded with the traditional greeting that suddenly sounded hollow and desperate. "Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation." The king's response revealed both the depth of his frustration and the impossible nature of the test he was about to impose upon his advisors. "My decision is firm," Nebuchadnezzar declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power mixed with barely controlled desperation. "If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap." The threat was not mere royal hyperbole, but a deadly serious ultimatum that reflected the king's growing paranoia about the loyalty and competence of his advisors. If these men truly possessed the wisdom and divine connection they claimed, then surely they should be able to discern both the content and meaning of dreams that came from the gods. Their failure to do so would prove them to be frauds, whose continued existence represented a drain on royal resources and a potential source of dangerous misinformation. But the king's ultimatum also contained a promise that revealed his understanding of the magnitude of what he was requesting. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, he continued, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honour. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. The wise men's response to this impossible demand was a masterpiece of diplomatic desperation that revealed both their genuine limitations and their growing terror at the king's unreasonable expectations. Let the king tell his servants the dream, they pleaded, and we will give its interpretation. When this appeal was rejected, they resorted to an argument that was both logically sound and politically suicidal. There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. The final appeal that the desperate wise men made to divine transcendence only served to enrage the king further and seal their fate. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, they concluded, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. The statement was theologically accurate but politically catastrophic, essentially admitting that their claimed connection to divine wisdom was fraudulent, and that they were helpless when faced with a genuine test of supernatural knowledge. King Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to this confession was swift and terrible. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, the court chroniclers recorded, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. The decree that went out from the royal palace was comprehensive in its scope and immediate in its implementation. Every person throughout the empire who claimed wisdom or supernatural knowledge was to be executed without delay. The death warrant that threatened to destroy the entire intellectual establishment of Babylon created a crisis that extended far beyond the immediate victims of royal rage. Daniel and his 3 friends, having recently completed their education and taken their places within the imperial administration, suddenly found themselves marked for execution, despite having no connection to the failed attempt at dream interpretation. It was Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who arrived at Daniel's quarters with the grim task of implementing the royal decree. The officer who bore responsibility for carrying out some of the most difficult commands in imperial service approached his duty with the professionalism that characterized elite palace guards, but also with the regret of someone who recognized the waste involved in destroying valuable servants of the crown. Daniel's response to the news of his impending execution revealed both the wisdom he had gained through his Babylonian education and the faith that remained the foundation of his character. Instead of panic or despair, he responded with questions that demonstrated his understanding of palace politics and his confidence that there might be alternatives to the seemingly inevitable disaster that threatened to engulf him and his friends. "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Daniel asked, his inquiry revealing both genuine confusion about the crisis and strategic thinking about how it might be resolved. The question demonstrated that he understood palace protocol well enough to know that such extreme measures were typically reserved for existential threats to royal authority rather than mere academic failures. When Arioch explained the situation, Daniel immediately recognized both the opportunity and the danger that the crisis presented. Here was a chance to demonstrate that the God of Israel possessed wisdom that surpassed all the accumulated knowledge of Babylonian civilization, but it was also a test that would require faith of unprecedented magnitude. Failure would mean not only his own death, but the destruction of his 3 friends who had shared his commitment to serving God faithfully in a pagan environment. The request that Daniel made to Arioch was audacious in its implications and revealed confidence that bordered on the supernatural. "Give me time," he asked, "and I will tell the king the interpretation." The promise was staggering in its boldness. A young man barely out of his educational program was volunteering to accomplish what the greatest minds in the empire had declared impossible. But Daniel's confidence was not based on his own wisdom or knowledge, but on his faith in the God who had sustained him through every previous test of his commitment. The young man who had trusted divine providence to honour his faithfulness in matters of food and study was now prepared to stake everything on the belief that the God of Israel could reveal mysteries that were hidden from all human wisdom. The meeting that Daniel called with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was both a council of war and a prayer meeting, as these 4 young men faced the greatest crisis of their lives with the same unity that had sustained them through their years of education and cultural pressure. The friends who had stood together in refusing the king's food were now called upon to stand together in seeking divine intervention that would save not only their own lives, but demonstrate God's sovereignty before the most powerful empire on earth. That they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, Daniel explained to his friends, outlining a strategy that was entirely dependent on supernatural intervention. The word secret was carefully chosen, acknowledging that what they needed was not merely interpretation of a dream that the king remembered, but revelation of divine mysteries that had been hidden from all human knowledge. The prayer vigil that followed was unlike anything these young men had experienced during their years in Babylon. This was not the routine devotion that had sustained them through daily challenges, but desperate intercession for divine intervention in circumstances that offered no human solution. They were calling upon the God who had allowed them to be conquered and exiled to demonstrate his power before the very king who had destroyed their homeland and carried them into captivity. But even as they prayed, Daniel and his friends understood that they were participating in something far larger than their own survival. The crisis that threatened to destroy the wise men of Babylon was actually an opportunity for the God of Israel to reveal his superiority over all the false gods and human philosophies that competed for ultimate authority in the hearts and minds of mankind. The revelation that came to Daniel during the night was both an answer to their desperate prayers and a glimpse into the cosmic purposes that governed the rise and fall of earthly empires. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision the ancient chroniclers recorded, noting how divine wisdom chose to communicate through the same medium that had created the crisis, a dream that burned itself into the recipient's consciousness with perfect clarity and permanent retention. But before Daniel rushed to the palace to claim his reward and save his life, he paused to offer worship to the God who had honoured their faith with supernatural revelation. The prayer of thanksgiving that poured from his heart revealed both his understanding of the theological significance of what had occurred and his recognition that personal salvation was secondary to the greater purpose of demonstrating divine sovereignty. Blessed be the name of God for ever and ever, Daniel prayed, his words reflecting both relief at their deliverance and awe at being chosen as instruments of divine revelation. For wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. The theological declaration that formed the centre of Daniel's prayer would prove prophetic in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The God who was about to reveal the content and meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream was simultaneously revealing his control over the very forces that the king imagined himself to command. The empire that seemed so permanent and powerful was actually subject to divine purposes that would accomplish themselves regardless of human intentions or resistance. Daniel's appearance before King Nebuchadnezzar the following morning created a dramatic contrast that highlighted the difference between human wisdom and divine revelation. Where the greatest minds in Babylon had confessed their helplessness and faced execution for their failure, this young Hebrew exile approached the throne with confidence that seemed almost supernatural in its serenity. The king's first question revealed both his desperate hope for resolution and his skepticism about the ability of someone so young to accomplish what his most experienced advisors had declared impossible. "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Nebuchadnezzar asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man whose entire worldview hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Daniel's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic theology that gave all credit to divine revelation while avoiding any suggestion that he possessed supernatural powers in his own right. "The secret which the king has demanded," he began, "the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." The declaration was both humble and revolutionary, acknowledging the limitations of human wisdom while proclaiming the existence of divine knowledge that transcended all earthly understanding. But perhaps most significantly, Daniel was announcing that the God of Israel, the deity of a conquered people, possessed authority and wisdom that surpassed all the gods of Babylon. The dream that Daniel proceeded to describe unfolded with a detail and vividness that left no doubt about the supernatural source of his knowledge. Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance, he began, his words recreating the vision that had both fascinated and terrified the king during his sleepless nights. The head of this statue was made of pure gold, Daniel continued, his description building the image piece by piece with the precision of an eyewitness account. Its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. The statue that Daniel described was magnificent and terrible, a towering representation of human achievement that seemed to embody the power and glory of earthly kingdoms. Yet there was something ominous about its construction, a fundamental instability that suggested internal weakness despite its impressive appearance. While you were watching, Daniel continued his narrative building toward the climactic moment that would transform the entire vision, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. The interpretation that Daniel provided for this remarkable vision revealed divine purposes that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of Babylonian politics into the ultimate destiny of human civilization itself. You, Your Majesty, are the King of Kings, he explained, acknowledging Nebuchadnezzar's current supremacy while placing it within a larger context of divine sovereignty. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory, but the golden head was only the beginning of a succession of empires that would rise and fall according to divine purposes rather than human ambition. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours, Daniel prophesied, describing the silver chest and arms that represented the next phase of world history. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. The fourth kingdom that Daniel described was the most terrible of all, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Yet even this seemingly invincible empire would contain the seeds of its own destruction, represented by the feet of iron mixed with clay that could not maintain their cohesion under pressure. But the most significant element of the entire vision was the stone cut out without human hands that would ultimately destroy all earthly kingdoms and establish a divine kingdom that would never be destroyed. In the time of those kings, Daniel declared, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. The impact of Daniel's revelation on King Nebuchadnezzar was immediate and profound. The monarch who had threatened to execute all his wise men for their failure now found himself confronted with knowledge that clearly surpassed human understanding. More significantly, he was forced to acknowledge that the God of a conquered people possessed wisdom and authority that exceeded anything his own advisors could provide. Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, Nebuchadnezzar declared, his words representing a remarkable theological confession from the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. The king who had carried away the vessels of Solomon's temple was now acknowledging the supremacy of the God those vessels had been designed to honor. The rewards that Nebuchadnezzar bestowed upon Daniel reflected both his gratitude for the dream's revelation and his recognition that he was dealing with someone who possessed access to supernatural wisdom. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. But perhaps most significantly of all, Daniel's faithfulness to his friends was rewarded when he requested positions for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego within the provincial administration. The young men who had stood together in prayer during the crisis now found themselves elevated to positions where they could serve together in administering the very empire that had conquered their homeland. The transformation was remarkable in its scope and implications. 4 Hebrew exiles who had begun their Babylonian experience as captives, marked for cultural assimilation, were now the most powerful administrators in the empire's most important province. The God who had honoured their faithfulness in small matters had elevated them to positions where their influence could shape the destiny of nations. Yet beneath the surface of this remarkable success lay the understanding that greater tests were undoubtedly ahead. The young men who had trusted God through dietary restrictions and educational pressures now faced the far more complex challenges of wielding power in a pagan empire while maintaining their commitment to the God of Israel. The stage was set for confrontations that would test whether faith that had proven sufficient for personal trials would remain unshakable when the cost of obedience might include not just personal loss, but the destruction of everything they had worked to achieve. The God who had demonstrated his wisdom through Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream was preparing his servants for trials that would reveal whether their trust in divine sovereignty was absolute or merely convenient. The empire that had seemed so permanent and powerful was actually moving according to divine purposes that would ultimately establish a kingdom that no human force could destroy. And the young men who had been chosen to serve as instruments of divine revelation were about to discover that their greatest victories would come not through political manoeuvring or administrative competence, but through uncompromising faithfulness to the God whose kingdom would endure forever. The golden statue that rose from the plain of Dura was a monument to human pride so audacious in its conception and overwhelming in its execution that it seemed to mock the very heavens themselves. 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, this gleaming colossus dominated the landscape for miles around, its polished surface catching and throwing back the Mesopotamian sunlight with a brilliance that could be seen from the walls of Babylon itself. King Nebuchadnezzar had ordered its construction not merely as an artistic achievement, but as a theological statement that would reshape the religious landscape of his entire empire. The location chosen for this massive undertaking was itself laden with symbolic significance. The plain of Dura, a broad expanse of fertile land southwest of Babylon, provided the perfect natural amphitheatre for the spectacle that Nebuchadnezzar was planning. Here, representatives from every corner of his vast empire could gather to witness a demonstration of royal power that would dwarf any previous display of imperial magnificence. But the statue's most shocking feature was not its size or its location, but its composition. Where Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream had described a figure with a golden head representing Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, this monument was made entirely of gold from head to foot. The message was unmistakable. The Babylonian Empire would not be succeeded by inferior kingdoms of silver, bronze, and iron, but would endure forever in golden splendour under the divine mandate of its eternal king. The construction of such a monument required resources that staggered even the imagination of those accustomed to royal excess. The amount of gold necessary to plate a structure of this magnitude represented the wealth of entire nations, while the engineering challenges involved in creating a stable foundation for such a massive figure tested the limits of Babylonian technical expertise. Yet Nebuchadnezzar had pressed forward with the project with an obsession that suggested psychological as well as political motivations. The royal decree that summoned officials from throughout the empire to witness the statue's dedication was unprecedented in its scope and comprehensive in its reach. "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages," the proclamation declared, establishing the truly international character of the gathering that would soon converge on the plain of Dura. This was not merely a Babylonian religious ceremony, but a redefinition of imperial authority that would affect every subject of the crown. The list of officials commanded to attend read like a directory of imperial administration: satraps who governed entire provinces, administrators who managed local affairs, governors who ruled major cities, councillors who advised on policy matters, treasurers who controlled financial resources, judges who interpreted law, magistrates who enforced regulations, and all the rulers of the provinces who wielded authority in the king's name. As these dignitaries converged on the plain of Dura from every corner of the known world, the diversity of the gathering demonstrated both the extent of Babylonian power and the challenge that Nebuchadnezzar was attempting to address through this unprecedented ceremony. Here were representatives of dozens of different peoples, each with their own languages, customs, and religious traditions, all bound together under Babylonian rule but maintaining distinct identities that potentially threatened imperial unity. The elaborate preparations for the dedication ceremony revealed the king's understanding that this event would serve purposes far beyond mere religious observance. A massive orchestra had been assembled, featuring musicians from throughout the empire who had been trained to perform in perfect synchronization. The musical instruments themselves represented the finest examples of ancient craftsmanship. Horns whose deep tones could carry for miles across open terrain, flutes whose delicate melodies could touch the human heart, harps whose strings seemed to capture celestial harmonies, lyres whose haunting voices spoke of ancient mysteries, psalteries whose complex rhythms suggested mathematical perfection underlying cosmic order. But it was the ceremony itself that revealed the true audacity of Nebuchadnezzar's enterprise. The royal herald who addressed the assembled multitude spoke with authority that seemed to claim dominion not merely over earthly kingdoms, but over the spiritual allegiances of every person present. "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages," his voice rang out across the plain, "that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." The command was shocking in its implications and revolutionary in its scope. This was not merely a request for political submission or ceremonial deference, but a demand for religious worship that violated the most fundamental convictions of many who heard it. The king, who had recently acknowledged that Daniel's God was the God of gods, was now demanding that his subjects worship a golden idol that represented his own divinity and the eternal supremacy of his empire. The consequences threatened for disobedience were as swift as they were terrible. "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace," the herald proclaimed, his words sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. The furnace itself had been constructed specifically for this purpose, its flames visible from a considerable distance as a constant reminder of the fate that awaited anyone who dared to defy the royal command. The furnace represented more than an execution device. It was a theological statement about the power of Nebuchadnezzar's gods versus any competing religious claims. In ancient Near Eastern thought, the ability to destroy one's enemies through fire was considered a divine prerogative, and the king who commanded such destruction was demonstrating his connection to cosmic forces that transcended ordinary human authority. As the moment of decision approached and the royal orchestra prepared to signal the beginning of the worship ceremony, three men in the vast crowd faced a choice that would test everything they claimed to believe about loyalty, courage, and the ultimate source of authority in the universe. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Hebrew names that these men had never forgotten despite their Babylonian appellations, found themselves confronting a demand that struck at the very heart of their faith and identity. The irony of their situation was profound and bitter. These were men who had risen to positions of significant authority within the very empire that now demanded they violate their most fundamental convictions. Their success in Babylonian administration had been built on their ability to serve effectively while maintaining their Hebrew identity. But now they were being forced to choose between their careers and their souls. The sound that suddenly filled the air across the plain of Dura was magnificent and terrible in its overwhelming power. Horn and flute, harp and lyre, psaltery and symphony, every instrument played in perfect harmony to create a musical experience that seemed to transport listeners beyond earthly concerns into realms of transcendent beauty. The psychological impact was carefully calculated and devastatingly effective. creating an atmosphere in which resistance to the royal command seemed not only dangerous but almost blasphemous. The response to this musical signal was immediate and comprehensive. As if controlled by a single will, the vast multitude of officials, administrators and dignitaries fell prostrate before the golden image, their colourful robes creating a carpet of submission that stretched across the plain like a living tapestry. Representatives of dozens of nations and cultures found themselves united in worship of the monument that proclaimed Nebuchadnezzar's eternal supremacy. But in the midst of this ocean of prostrate bodies, 3 figures remained standing with a defiance that seemed to challenge not only royal authority, but the very order of the universe itself. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had made their choice, and their upright postures proclaimed to everyone present that there were still some things more important than life itself, some convictions that could not be compromised regardless of the consequences. The sight of these 3 men maintaining their dignity while surrounded by thousands of prostrate worshippers was both inspiring and terrifying to those who witnessed it. Here was courage that transcended normal human limitations, faith that proved stronger than the most basic instinct for survival, and commitment to principle that seemed almost superhuman in its unwavering intensity. The Chaldeans who reported this act of defiance to King Nebuchadnezzar were motivated by more than simple loyalty to royal commands. These were members of the priestly class who had seen their own influence diminished by the rise of Hebrew administrators whose wisdom seemed to surpass their own. The opportunity to eliminate these foreign competitors while demonstrating their own faithfulness to Babylonian religious traditions was too valuable to ignore. "There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon," they reported to the king, their words carefully chosen to emphasize both the ingratitude of the accused and the potential threat they represented to imperial unity. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up." The accusation was devastating in its political implications and precise in its theological focus. These were not merely cases of ceremonial negligence or administrative oversight, but deliberate acts of religious rebellion that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Nebuchadnezzar's authority was based. If Hebrew officials could defy royal commands regarding worship with impunity, what message would that send to other subject peoples who might be tempted to assert their own religious independence? King Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to this report was explosive in its intensity and revealing in its personal character. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how the king's anger seemed to transcend normal political calculation and enter the realm of personal betrayal. The confrontation that followed was unlike any previous interaction between the king and his Hebrew administrators. Where Daniel's interpretation of the royal dream had established a relationship based on mutual respect and divine revelation, this crisis involved direct challenge to royal authority that could not be resolved through diplomatic accommodation or theological discussion. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," the king demanded, his voice carrying both hurt and rage, "that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up?" The question revealed the depth of Nebuchadnezzar's sense of betrayal. These were men he had personally elevated to positions of trust and authority, yet they were now defying him in the most public and humiliating manner possible. But the king's next words demonstrated that even in his fury, he maintained enough political wisdom to offer these valuable servants one final opportunity to save themselves. Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. The offer was generous beyond what royal protocol normally demanded, reflecting both Nebuchadnezzar's genuine appreciation for their administrative abilities and his desire to avoid losing such capable officials. Yet the warning that accompanied this merciful offer was terrible in its finality and comprehensive in its implications. "But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace," the king declared, his words carrying the full weight of imperial authority. "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" The final challenge that Nebuchadnezzar issued was perhaps the most revealing aspect of his entire confrontation with these Hebrew officials. The question, "Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" demonstrated that the king understood this crisis to be fundamentally about competing claims to divine authority rather than mere administrative disagreement or cultural misunderstanding. The response that came from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would become one of the most famous declarations of faith in recorded history, a statement that transcended the immediate circumstances of their crisis to address the fundamental question of where ultimate trust should be placed when human authority conflicts with divine command. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter," they began, their words carrying a dignity that seemed untouched by the terror of their circumstances. The statement was not disrespectful, but simply acknowledged that their decision had already been made, and that no amount of royal pressure could alter their fundamental commitments. If that is the case, they continued, building toward a declaration that would echo through history, "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O King." The first part of their response was a confident assertion of divine power that directly challenged Nebuchadnezzar's assumption that no god could compete with Babylonian authority. But it was the second part of their declaration that revealed the true depth of their faith and the absolute nature of their commitment to the God of Israel. "But if not," they concluded with words that have inspired courage in countless believers facing their own impossible circumstances, "let it be known to you, O King, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." The phrase, "but if not," represented faith in its purest and most challenging form, trust in God that was not dependent on favourable outcomes or divine intervention that guaranteed personal safety. These men were acknowledging that their God possessed the power to deliver them from the furnace, but they were simultaneously declaring that their obedience to him was not conditional upon such deliverance. The impact of this declaration on King Nebuchadnezzar was immediate and catastrophic. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the chroniclers recorded, noting how the king's rage had moved beyond rational political calculation into the realm of personal vengeance. The command that the king issued for their execution was designed to ensure not only their deaths, but their complete annihilation in the most painful and public manner possible. "Heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated," he ordered, his words revealing a desire for vengeance that exceeded even normal standards of royal justice. The furnace that had been prepared for this purpose was a technological marvel that demonstrated Babylonian engineering expertise applied to the most terrible purposes. Heated to temperatures that exceeded anything normally used for execution, the blazing inferno became a kind of earthly hell that seemed designed to demonstrate the futility of opposing royal will. The men chosen to carry out the execution were certain mighty men of valour who were in his army, indicating that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to ensure that there would be no possibility of escape or rescue. These were elite soldiers whose strength and skill made them capable of overpowering any resistance that the condemned men might offer. But the intensity of the furnace that the king had commanded proved to be a double-edged sword. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the court records noted, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The very excess of royal fury had resulted in the death of loyal soldiers, while the intended victims had not yet even entered the furnace. The sight of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego falling bound into the midst of the blazing furnace should have marked the end of their remarkable story, and the vindication of Nebuchadnezzar's claims about the impotence of foreign gods. Instead, it became the prelude to a demonstration of divine power that would shake the foundations of the Babylonian Empire and transform the king's understanding of ultimate authority. The miracle that occurred within the furnace was visible to everyone present and undeniable in its supernatural character. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed to his counselors, his voice carrying amazement that bordered on terror. "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." The appearance of the fourth figure in the furnace represented divine intervention of the most dramatic and unmistakable kind. This was not merely deliverance from death, but transformation of the instrument of execution into a place of divine fellowship where the faithful could walk in safety while surrounded by forces that should have destroyed them instantly. The king's immediate recognition that the fourth figure possessed divine characteristics revealed both his theological sophistication and his growing understanding that he was witnessing something that transcended all previous categories of his experience. The ruler who had demanded worship of his golden image was now observing worship of the true God taking place in circumstances that made human intervention impossible. The deliverance that followed was complete and undeniable in its supernatural character. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerged from the furnace at the king's command, they bore no trace of their ordeal beyond the severed ropes that had bound them. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. The amazed observers recorded. King Nebuchadnezzar's response to this miracle was immediate theological capitulation that revealed how completely his understanding of divine power had been transformed. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," he declared, "who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God." The decree that the king issued in the aftermath of this demonstration was revolutionary in its implications for religious freedom throughout the Babylonian Empire. "Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." The promotion that followed their miraculous deliverance elevated Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions within the provincial administration, demonstrating that their faithfulness had not only preserved their lives, but had actually advanced their careers in ways that compromise never could have achieved. The impact of this miracle extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of 3 Hebrew officials facing execution. Word of their deliverance spread throughout the empire, inspiring faith among other exiled peoples, while simultaneously demonstrating that the God of Israel was not limited by geographical boundaries or political circumstances. But perhaps most significantly, the fiery furnace had become a laboratory for testing the absolute nature of faith under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The 3 men who had declared their willingness to die rather than compromise their convictions had discovered that uncompromising faith often shines brightest under fire, and that God's power to deliver is never more evident than when human resources are completely exhausted. The stage was set for even greater tests of faith and demonstrations of divine sovereignty as the story of God's people in exile continued to unfold in the palaces and provinces of the Babylonian Empire. The years that followed the miracle of the fiery furnace should have marked a period of unprecedented spiritual awakening for King Nebuchadnezzar and his empire. The monarch who had witnessed divine intervention on such a dramatic scale, who had seen his most trusted advisors delivered from certain death through supernatural power, might have been expected to embrace a humility that reflected his new understanding of ultimate authority. Instead, the passage of time seemed to dim the memory of what he had witnessed, allowing pride to reassert itself with even greater force than before. The Palace of Babylon during these years became a showcase of royal magnificence that exceeded anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Nebuchadnezzar's building projects stretched across the empire like monuments to human achievement, each structure designed to proclaim the eternal glory of his reign and the invincible power of Babylonian civilization. The famous Hanging Gardens, constructed to ease his queen's homesickness for her mountainous homeland, represented only one jewel in a crown of architectural marvels that transformed the capital into a wonder that dazzled visitors from every corner of the known world. The king's personal apartments within this magnificent complex reflected his growing sense of his own divinity and the cosmic significance of his achievements. Walls covered with gold leaf caught and multiplied the light of countless oil lamps, creating an atmosphere that seemed to glow with supernatural radiance. Tapestries woven from silk and precious metals depicted scenes of royal triumph that elevated Nebuchadnezzar's military victories to the level of mythological achievement. The very air seemed perfumed with incense that suggested divine approval of everything the king had accomplished. But it was the throne room itself that most clearly revealed the dangerous direction of Nebuchadnezzar's psychological and spiritual development. The massive chamber had been redesigned to create an environment where the king appeared as a godlike figure dispensing wisdom and justice from a throne that seemed to bridge earth and heaven. The ceiling disappeared into shadows that suggested infinite height, while the floor was a masterpiece of intricate stonework that created patterns so complex that walking across them felt like treading on captured starlight. From this throne, Nebuchadnezzar ruled over an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing dozens of different peoples and cultures under a single administrative system that was the marvel of the ancient world. The tribute that flowed into Babylon from conquered territories funded not only the king's building projects, but also a lifestyle that seemed to confirm his growing belief in his own quasi-divine status. The court culture that developed around this magnificent monarch reflected and reinforced his inflated sense of personal importance. Courtiers competed to devise new forms of flattery that would capture royal attention, while poets and musicians created works that portrayed Nebuchadnezzar as the greatest ruler in human history. The very protocols of palace life were designed to emphasize the king's separation from ordinary humanity and his special relationship with cosmic forces that governed the destiny of nations. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the gradual erosion of any voices that might challenge the king's growing arrogance, or remind him of the lessons he should have learned from his previous encounters with divine power. The wise men who had once confessed their limitations when faced with supernatural mysteries were replaced by sycophants who assured the king that his wisdom surpassed that of gods and men alike. The Hebrew advisors who had demonstrated such remarkable faithfulness were increasingly marginalized as Nebuchadnezzar surrounded himself with counselors who told him only what he wanted to hear. It was in this atmosphere of unchecked pride and imperial self-congratulation that Nebuchadnezzar experienced another dream that would prove even more significant than the vision of the great statue that had first brought Daniel to prominence. But unlike his previous nocturnal revelations, this dream came not as a mysterious puzzle to be solved, but as a clear and terrifying preview of divine judgment that would humble his pride and demonstrate the ultimate source of authority over earthly kingdoms. The vision that haunted the king's sleep was both beautiful and ominous, beginning with imagery that seemed to celebrate the very achievements that had become the foundation of his inflated self-regard. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, Nebuchadnezzar later recounted, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. The tree that dominated this divine vision was magnificent beyond description, a symbol of life and growth that seemed to embody everything positive about earthly authority and natural blessing. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all, the king continued, his words painting a picture of prosperity and beneficence that appeared to vindicate his understanding of his own reign. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. But the dream that had begun with such positive imagery took a dramatic and terrifying turn, as divine judgment intruded upon this scene of pastoral perfection. I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven, Nebuchadnezzar recalled, his voice still carrying echoes of the terror he had felt at this supernatural intervention. The command that this heavenly messenger delivered transformed the entire vision from celebration to condemnation, from blessing to judgment, from vindication to warning. He cried aloud and said thus, "Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beast get out from under it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him have his portion with the beasts in the grass of the earth." The The transformation that the Heavenly Watcher described was as complete as it was humiliating, reducing the mighty tree to a mere stump, while simultaneously revealing that the imagery was not merely botanical but deeply personal. "Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given to him," the divine messenger continued, "and let 7 times pass over him." The decree that concluded this terrifying vision left no doubt about its ultimate source or its cosmic significance. "This decision is by the decree of the Watchers, and the sentence by the word of the Holy Ones," the heavenly voice proclaimed, "in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men." When Nebuchadnezzar awoke from this dream, he found himself in the grip of an anxiety that no amount of royal power or imperial magnificence could dispel. Unlike his previous dream, which had faded from memory upon waking, this vision remained vivid and detailed, burning itself into his consciousness with a clarity that suggested divine origin and ultimate significance. The king's immediate summons of his wise men revealed both his growing desperation and his declining faith in traditional sources of counsel. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace," he told the assembled magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, his words carrying an undertone of fear that contrasted sharply with his apparent confidence. "I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head troubled me." But when the king recounted his dream to these traditional advisers, their response was the same helpless silence that had characterized their failure during the earlier crisis with the great statue. The vision that Nebuchadnezzar had received was too clearly divine in origin, and too obviously threatening in its implications for any earthly wisdom to interpret safely. These were men whose livelihoods depended on royal favour, and no amount of supernatural insight was worth the risk of delivering a message that would enrage their sovereign. It was only when Daniel finally appeared before the king that any hope of interpretation became possible. "At last Daniel came before me," Nebuchadnezzar recalled. "His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in him is the spirit of the holy God." The king's description of Daniel revealed both his continued confusion about the source of his advisor's wisdom and his growing recognition that supernatural insight was required for the crisis he was facing. Daniel's reaction to the king's recounting of the dream was immediate and visceral, revealing his understanding of its ominous implications before he had even begun to provide interpretation. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how the young Hebrew's composure was shaken by what he had heard. The king's encouragement of Daniel to speak freely demonstrated both his genuine need for guidance and his dangerous blindness to the implications of what he was requesting. "Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you," Nebuchadnezzar said, his words revealing his assumption that the vision must somehow be positive, despite its obviously threatening character. Daniel's response revealed both his genuine affection for the king who had elevated him to such high position, and his deep sorrow at the divine judgment that was about to fall upon someone he had come to respect despite his pagan beliefs. "My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies," he exclaimed, his words expressing the heartfelt wish that the vision might apply to anyone other than the king himself. But Daniel's personal feelings could not alter the clear meaning of divine revelation, and his interpretation of the dream was both compassionate and uncompromising in its accuracy. "The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens and which could be seen by all the earth," he began, "that is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth." The identification of Nebuchadnezzar with the great tree was both flattering and ominous, acknowledging the genuine achievements of his reign, while simultaneously warning of the judgment that pride would inevitably bring. Daniel's interpretation continued with the terrible precision of divine justice. And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven and saying, "Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king." The specific punishment that Daniel described was unprecedented in its humiliation and comprehensive in its scope. "They shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen," he continued, his words painting a picture of degradation that reduced the most powerful man on earth to the level of a wild animal. "They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses." Yet even in the midst of this terrible judgment, Daniel was able to offer hope based on the symbolic elements of the divine vision. "And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and roots of the tree," he explained, "your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules." The counsel that Daniel offered in the aftermath of this interpretation was both practical and spiritual, representing perhaps the last opportunity for Nebuchadnezzar to avoid the judgment that his pride was bringing upon him. "Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you," Daniel pleaded, his words carrying the urgency of someone who understood the spiritual dynamics at work. "Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity." But the advice that might have saved Nebuchadnezzar from the humiliation that awaited him fell on ears that had been deafened by years of uncritical flattery and unlimited power. The king, who had once acknowledged the sovereignty of Daniel's God, had allowed success to erode his spiritual sensitivity, leaving him vulnerable to the very pride that the divine vision had warned against. 12 months passed after Daniel's interpretation, during which Nebuchadnezzar continued to live and rule as if no divine warning had ever been given. The delay in judgment might have been interpreted as evidence that the vision was merely a nightmare rather than divine revelation, but in reality it represented the patience of divine mercy, providing final opportunity for repentance that would never come. The moment when judgment finally fell was chosen with precision that revealed both divine timing and poetic justice. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon, the court records noted, documenting how the king was engaged in the very activity that had led to his spiritual downfall, contemplating his own achievements with satisfaction that bordered on worship. The words that Nebuchadnezzar spoke at this crucial moment revealed how completely he had ignored Daniel's warning, and how thoroughly pride had consumed his understanding of the source of his success. "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honour of my majesty," he declared, his voice carrying the arrogance that would trigger immediate divine response. The judgment that fell upon Nebuchadnezzar was swift and comprehensive, demonstrating the reality of divine sovereignty over even the most powerful earthly rulers. While the word was still in the king's mouth, the chroniclers recorded with stark simplicity, "A voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you." The transformation that followed was immediate and devastating in its completeness. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar, the court records noted, documenting how divine judgment could override human power with supernatural efficiency. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. The specific form that Nebuchadnezzar's madness took was both humiliating and symbolically perfect, reducing the king who had claimed divine prerogatives to a condition that was literally bestial. The ruler who had built monuments to his own glory was stripped of every vestige of human dignity, forced to acknowledge through his very existence that earthly power was ultimately subject to heavenly authority. The 7 years during which this judgment continued represented a period of testing that was both personal and cosmic in its implications. While Nebuchadnezzar wandered in the wilderness of his own pride-induced insanity, the empire he had built continued to function under other administrators, demonstrating that even the most indispensable leaders were ultimately replaceable in the economy of divine providence. But the most remarkable aspect of this divine judgment was not its severity but its ultimate purpose, not destruction but restoration, not condemnation but correction. The madness that had stripped Nebuchadnezzar of his royal dignity was designed to teach him lessons about ultimate authority that he could learn in no other way. When the appointed time was finally complete and divine mercy chose to restore the humbled king, the transformation was as dramatic as his original fall had been devastating. And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, the king later testified, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honoured him who lives forever. The worship that poured from Nebuchadnezzar's restored heart revealed how completely his understanding had been transformed by his years of humiliation. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation, he declared, his words reflecting genuine recognition of divine sovereignty that pride had previously made impossible. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" The restoration that followed this spiritual awakening was as complete as the judgment had been comprehensive. At the same time my reason returned to me, Nebuchadnezzar testified, and for the glory of my kingdom my honour and splendour returned to me. My counsellors and nobles resorted to me, I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. But perhaps most significantly of all, the king who emerged from 7 years of divine judgment was fundamentally different from the proud monarch who had fallen under its weight. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, he declared, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. The transformation was complete and permanent, demonstrating that divine judgment, however severe, was ultimately designed not for destruction, but for the restoration of proper relationship between creature and creator. The king who had once claimed credit for building Great Babylon had learned through bitter experience that all earthly achievement was ultimately dependent on divine permission and blessing. The stage was set for a new generation of rulers who would face their own tests of pride and humility, demonstrating whether the lessons learned through Nebuchadnezzar's experience could be transmitted to others, or whether each generation would be required to discover for themselves the ultimate source of authority in the universe. The years following Nebuchadnezzar's restoration had brought significant changes to the Babylonian Empire, though the lessons learned through divine judgment seemed to have died with the great king himself. When Nebuchadnezzar finally passed from the scene, his empire passed through a succession of rulers who possessed neither his military genius nor his hard-won wisdom about the ultimate source of earthly authority. The throne that had once been occupied by a humbled monarch who praised the King of heaven was now held by his grandson Belshazzar, a young man whose understanding of power had been shaped more by palace intrigue than by divine encounter. Belshazzar's rise to co-regency alongside his father Nabonidus represented the culmination of political manoeuvring that had little to do with fitness for leadership and everything to do with family connections and court favoritism. While Nabonidus pursued his archaeological interests and religious innovations in distant corners of the empire, often absent from Babylon for months at a time, effective rule fell to his son, whose experience with governance was limited to the ceremonial functions and administrative routines that characterized peaceful times. The young co-regent who found himself wielding imperial power was a product of the palace culture that had grown up around Babylonian supremacy, educated in an environment where the empire's dominance was simply assumed rather than earned through the kind of struggles that had forged his grandfather's character. To Belshazzar, Babylonian power was a birthright rather than a divine trust, a natural inheritance that required no special wisdom or humility to maintain. The political situation that confronted Belshazzar during his effective reign was far more complex and dangerous than the palace-bound prince fully comprehended. Beyond the empire's eastern borders, Cyrus the Persian was assembling a coalition of forces that would soon challenge Babylonian hegemony throughout the known world. The signs of impending crisis were visible to anyone who cared to look. Tribute payments were declining, provincial rebellions were becoming more frequent, and the loyalty of subject peoples was increasingly uncertain. But within the walls of Babylon itself, surrounded by the architectural marvels that proclaimed eternal Babylonian supremacy, it was easy to ignore these distant threats and focus instead on the immediate pleasures and ceremonial duties that filled the royal calendar. The city that Nebuchadnezzar had transformed into the wonder of the world still dazzled visitors with its magnificence. Its massive walls still seemed impregnable to any conceivable enemy, and its wealth still appeared inexhaustible. It was in this atmosphere of willful blindness to gathering storm clouds that Belshazzar conceived the idea for a feast that would surpass any celebration in Babylonian history. The occasion for this extravagant display was ostensibly political, a gathering of the empire's most important nobles and officials designed to demonstrate the continued strength and unity of Babylonian rule. But the true motivation was psychological, an attempt to convince himself and his subjects that the empire's glory remained undiminished despite the troubling reports that filtered in from frontier provinces. The preparations for this royal banquet required weeks of planning and enormous expenditures from the imperial treasury. The finest foods were gathered from every corner of the empire. The most precious wines were brought forth from royal cellars that had been accumulating treasures for generations, and the most skilled entertainers were summoned to provide diversions worthy of such an august assembly. But it was the guest list that revealed both the scope of Belshazzar's ambitions and his dangerous disconnect from political reality. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how the gathering was designed to project an image of imperial confidence that bore little relationship to actual circumstances. These were not merely local officials, but representatives of the empire's highest nobility, men whose continued loyalty was essential to maintaining Babylonian control over increasingly restive subject peoples. The banquet hall that housed this extraordinary gathering was itself a monument to Babylonian artistry and engineering skill. The vast chamber was capable of accommodating thousands of guests while maintaining the intimate atmosphere necessary for meaningful political communication. Its walls were decorated with gold leaf that caught and multiplied the light of countless oil lamps, creating an environment that seemed to glow with supernatural radiance. As the evening progressed and wine flowed with imperial generosity, the atmosphere in the banquet hall grew increasingly festive and correspondingly less restrained. The assembled nobles, many of whom had travelled great distances to attend this celebration, found themselves caught up in an atmosphere of artificial confidence that made the empire's problems seem distant and manageable. It was in this context of growing intoxication and diminishing judgment that Belshazzar made a decision that would transform a routine political celebration into a moment of cosmic confrontation between earthly pride and divine authority. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, the court records noted, documenting the moment when royal excess crossed the line into blasphemous sacrilege. The vessels that Belshazzar commanded to be brought forth were not merely valuable artifacts, but sacred objects that had been consecrated for worship in Solomon's temple decades earlier. These golden cups, silver bowls, and ornate implements had been crafted specifically for use in the service of the God of Israel, designed to facilitate worship that acknowledged his sovereignty over all earthly powers. When Nebuchadnezzar had originally carried these temple treasures to Babylon, he had treated them with the respect due to sacred objects, storing them carefully in the house of his gods, rather than treating them as common spoils of war. This careful handling reflected both his military sophistication and his religious sensitivity. Even pagan kings understood that objects consecrated to divine service carried spiritual significance that made their casual use dangerous. But Belshazzar's generation had grown up in an environment where Babylonian supremacy was simply assumed, where the conquest of Jerusalem was ancient history rather than living memory, and where the gods of subject peoples were regarded as curiosities rather than potential sources of supernatural danger. The young co-regent who ordered these sacred vessels brought to his banquet was motivated not by any conscious desire to offend the God of Israel, but by simple arrogance that saw all imperial possessions as existing for royal pleasure. The scene that unfolded as these sacred vessels were distributed throughout the banquet hall represented a collision between the sacred and the profane that was shocking in its casual disregard for spiritual realities. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, the chroniclers recorded, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. The act of drinking wine from vessels that had been consecrated for temple worship was more than mere sacrilege. It was a declaration of independence from divine authority that challenged the sovereignty of the God who had once demonstrated his power so dramatically before Belshazzar's grandfather. Each toast that was raised using these sacred implements was an implicit claim that Babylonian power had proven superior to Jewish faith, that earthly kingdoms could triumph over heavenly authority. But perhaps most offensive of all was the religious context within which this desecration took place. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone, the court records noted, documenting how the sacred vessels were used not merely for secular celebration, but for active worship of the false deities that represented everything opposed to the God of Israel. The irony was profound and theologically significant. Vessels that had been crafted to honour the one true God were now being used to celebrate idols made from materials that possessed no life, consciousness or power. The implements that had once facilitated worship of the Creator were now serving the glorification of created things that could neither see nor hear, nor respond to the devotion being offered to them. The divine response to this blasphemous celebration was immediate and unmistakable in its supernatural character. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, the court chroniclers recorded, their words capturing both the precise timing and the visible nature of divine intervention. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. The sight of a disembodied hand writing on the palace wall was terrifying beyond description, a manifestation of supernatural power that brought all conversation and celebration to an immediate halt. This was not a vision that could be dismissed as imagination or explained away as the product of too much wine. It was a visible, objective phenomenon that was witnessed by hundreds of the empire's most important officials. The reaction of King Belshazzar to this supernatural manifestation was immediate and devastating. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, the observers noted, so that the joints of his hips were loosed and his knees knocked against each other. The powerful young ruler who had been presiding over the greatest feast in Babylonian history was reduced to a trembling, terrified figure whose physical symptoms betrayed the depth of his psychological shock. The words that appeared on the palace wall were written in Aramaic script that was visible to all present, but incomprehensible in its meaning despite being composed in a language that many of the assembled guests could read. Mene, mene, tekel aparsin, the mysterious inscription declared, its stark simplicity somehow more ominous than any elaborate pronouncement of doom might have been. Belshazzar's immediate summons of the royal wise men revealed both his desperation for explanation and his continued reliance on traditional sources of supernatural insight that had repeatedly proven inadequate when confronted with genuine divine revelation. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, the court records noted, documenting how even direct divine communication could be greeted with attempts to find human solutions. The promise that Belshazzar offered to anyone who could interpret this supernatural writing reflected both the magnitude of his terror and his willingness to pay any price for understanding that might relieve his anxiety. Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation, he declared, shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. The offer of the position as third ruler in the kingdom was particularly significant, acknowledging the political reality that effective power was shared between Nabonidus and Belshazzar, while creating room for a new advisor whose wisdom might prove superior to that of existing court officials. The purple clothing and golden chain were symbols of highest honour that would mark the successful interpreter as someone who enjoyed ultimate royal favour. But despite these generous inducements, the assembled wise men found themselves as helpless before this divine writing as their predecessors had been when confronted with Nebuchadnezzar's forgotten dream. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation, the chroniclers recorded. noting how human wisdom consistently failed when faced with genuine supernatural communication. The failure of the court experts to provide any explanation for the mysterious writing only intensified Belshazzar's terror and created a crisis of confidence that spread throughout the assembled nobility. If the empire's greatest minds could not interpret divine communication that was literally written on the wall, what hope was there for understanding or averting whatever judgment might be approaching? It was the Queen Mother who finally provided the solution that had eluded all the professional interpreters and advisors. Her entrance into the banquet hall was itself dramatic, as this elderly woman who rarely appeared at court functions was moved by the crisis to offer counsel that she alone possessed. "O King, live forever," she began, using the traditional greeting that carried special poignancy given the circumstances. "Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change." The advice that followed revealed both her memory of past crises and her understanding of where supernatural wisdom could be found when human resources proved inadequate. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God," she continued, her words carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed divine power in action. "And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers." The description that the Queen Mother provided of Daniel revealed both his continued presence in the empire and his marginalization under the current administration. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, she explained, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. The summons that brought Daniel before King Belshazzar created a dramatic confrontation between generations and worldviews that highlighted how completely the lessons of the past had been forgotten. The aged Hebrew advisor who had served 3 Babylonian kings with distinction now faced a young ruler who knew him only by reputation and who had chosen to ignore the wisdom that had once been valued so highly. Daniel's appearance before Belshazzar was itself a study in contrasts. Where the king was young, impetuous, and terrified by supernatural manifestation, Daniel approached the crisis with the calm dignity of someone who had spent decades walking with God through impossible circumstances. His very presence seemed to bring a measure of peace to the chaotic atmosphere that had gripped the banquet hall. The king's initial address to Daniel revealed both his desperate need for interpretation and his skeptical attitude towards someone whose advice had been systematically ignored. "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, who my father the king brought from Judah?" Belshazzar asked, his words carrying undertones that seemed to question whether a Hebrew exile could possess wisdom relevant to Babylonian royal crises. The renewed offer of rewards that Belshazzar made to Daniel demonstrated both his continued desperation and his assumption that material inducements would be necessary to secure cooperation from someone who had been marginalized under his administration. "Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation," he promised, "you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Daniel's response to this offer was both gracious and firmly independent, revealing his understanding that divine wisdom could not be purchased through earthly rewards, and that his service to the king was motivated by higher considerations than personal advancement. "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another," he replied with quiet dignity. "Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation." But before providing the interpretation that Belshazzar desperately needed, Daniel took the opportunity to deliver a historical and theological lesson that placed the current crisis within the larger context of divine dealings with Babylonian royalty. His recounting of Nebuchadnezzar's pride, judgment, and eventual restoration served both as background information and as implicit warning about the spiritual dynamics that were once again at work. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, Daniel reminded the king, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. The application that Daniel made of this historical lesson was devastating in its directness and comprehensive in its condemnation of Belshazzar's choices. "But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this," he declared, his words carrying the authority of divine truth spoken through human lips. "And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven." The specific charges that Daniel brought against the young king reveal the gravity of his offence and the personal nature of his rebellion against divine authority. "They have brought the vessels of his house before you," Daniel continued, "and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines, have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified." The interpretation that followed was delivered with the precision of divine judgment and the finality of irreversible decree. "Meaning, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it," Daniel declared, explaining how the repeated word emphasized the completeness and certainty of the judgment. "Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians." The three words that had appeared on the palace wall thus contained the complete story of Belshazzar's downfall and the empire's destruction. The kingdom that had seemed so permanent and powerful had been measured by divine standards and found deficient, its days numbered and its fate sealed through the very celebration that was intended to demonstrate its continued strength. Belshazzar's response to this devastating interpretation revealed both his continued reliance on earthly gestures and his inability to grasp the spiritual realities that had already determined his fate. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom, the court records noted, documenting how the king honoured the messenger while ignoring the message. But even as Daniel was receiving these empty honours, the forces that would fulfill his interpretation were already moving against the city. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, the chroniclers recorded with stark simplicity, noting how divine judgment could override human power with supernatural efficiency. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The fall of Babylon that night was as swift as it was complete, demonstrating that earthly power, no matter how impressive its appearance, remained subject to divine purposes that could accomplish themselves regardless of human resistance or preparation. The empire that had dominated the ancient world for generations was transferred to new rulers in the space of a few hours, fulfilling prophecies that had been given decades earlier. The transformation was remarkable in its thoroughness and precision. Where Belshazzar had ruled as co-regent of the greatest empire on earth, he died as a victim of his own arrogance and spiritual blindness. Where Babylon had stood as the symbol of human achievement and imperial permanence, it now served as evidence that kingdoms rise and fall according to divine judgment rather than human ambition. The stage was set for a new chapter in the story of God's people in exile, as Persian rule would bring both new opportunities and new challenges for those who sought to maintain their faith while serving in the corridors of imperial power. The handwriting on the wall had proven that God's judgment endures even when earthly kingdoms crumble into dust. The Persian Empire that emerged from the ashes of Babylonian power was fundamentally different in its approach to governing diverse populations, bringing with it administrative innovations and cultural policies that would reshape the ancient world for centuries to come. When Darius the Mede assumed control of the former Babylonian territories, he inherited not only vast wealth and strategic territory, but also the complex challenge of integrating existing governmental structures with Persian imperial systems. Unlike the Babylonian approach to empire, which had relied heavily on cultural assimilation and the systematic replacement of local traditions with imperial customs, Persian policy emphasized administrative efficiency while permitting remarkable religious and cultural diversity among subject peoples. This tolerance was not born of philosophical conviction, but of practical wisdom. The Persians had learned that stable rule over vast distances required the cooperation of local populations rather than their complete transformation. The governmental structure that Darius implemented reflected this sophisticated understanding of imperial administration. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, the court records noted, documenting how the empire was divided into 120 satraps, manageable administrative units that could maintain effective communication with the central authority while adapting to local conditions and customs. But perhaps most significantly for the future of God's people in exile, Persian administration created opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than ethnic origin or religious affiliation. Where Babylonian service had required careful navigation of complex cultural expectations and religious sensitivities, Persian bureaucracy offered positions to anyone who could demonstrate the competence and loyalty necessary for effective governance. It was in this environment of administrative reorganization and expanded opportunity that Daniel found his remarkable talents once again in demand by imperial authority. The Hebrew exile who had served 3 Babylonian kings with distinction was approaching his 80th year, an age when most men would have retired from active service to enjoy whatever comfort their careers had provided. Instead, Daniel discovered that his decades of faithful service had prepared him for perhaps the most challenging assignment of his entire career. The appointment that Darius offered to Daniel was both recognition of his exceptional abilities and acknowledgement of the practical needs that the new Persian administration faced in governing territories that had been Babylonian for generations. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, the chroniclers recorded, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. The prospect of Daniel's elevation to supreme administrative authority under Persian rule represented a remarkable testament to both his personal character and the effectiveness of his service under previous regimes. Here was a man whose religious convictions had never wavered despite decades of pressure to conform, whose administrative competence had proven itself through multiple political transitions, and whose integrity had earned him the trust of rulers whose worldviews were fundamentally different from his own. But Daniel's very excellence and the favour he enjoyed with King Darius created a dangerous situation that would soon test his faith more severely than any previous crisis he'd faced. The other governors and satraps who found themselves potentially subject to his authority were not merely disappointed by their own failure to achieve such recognition. They were threatened by the prospect of serving under someone whose standards of honesty and efficiency would inevitably expose their own corruption and incompetence. The political dynamic that developed around Daniel's potential promotion was complex and dangerous, involving not just professional jealousy, but ethnic prejudice and religious bigotry that added volatile elements to what might otherwise have been routine court competition. These were men who had expected Persian rule to provide new opportunities for personal advancement and financial gain, only to discover that merit-based promotion might actually reduce their influence and income. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, the court records noted, documenting how Daniel's colleagues embarked on a systematic investigation designed to uncover evidence of corruption, disloyalty, or administrative incompetence that could be used to destroy his reputation and eliminate him as a competitor for royal favour. The search for incriminating evidence against Daniel was thorough and professional, conducted by men who understood how imperial bureaucracies functioned and where violations of policy or law were most likely to occur. They examined his financial records for evidence of embezzlement, investigated his administrative decisions for signs of favouritism or negligence, and scrutinised his personal relationships for any connections that might suggest divided loyalty or security risks. But the investigation that was intended to expose Daniel's weaknesses instead revealed the remarkable integrity that had characterised his entire career in imperial service. But they could find no charge or fault, the frustrated investigators were forced to conclude, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. The Hebrew exile whose religious convictions had made him suspect in the eyes of his colleagues had actually proven to be the most trustworthy and competent administrator in the entire Persian bureaucracy. The failure to find any legitimate grounds for accusation against Daniel forced his enemies to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of their conflict with him. This was not a matter of administrative incompetence or political disloyalty, but a fundamental difference in worldview and moral standards that made coexistence within the same governmental structure increasingly difficult. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God," they concluded, their words revealing both their frustration with Daniel's integrity and their understanding that his religious convictions provided the only avenue for attack that might prove successful. The strategy that emerged from this analysis was both clever and diabolical, designed to exploit the one area where Daniel's loyalty to his God might conflict with his service to the Persian crown. Rather than attacking Daniel directly, his enemies would create a situation where faithfulness to divine law would inevitably result in violation of a royal decree, making his destruction appear to be the natural consequence of his own religious fanaticism rather than the result of political conspiracy. The approach that Daniel's enemies took to King Darius was a masterpiece of political manipulation, carefully crafted to appeal to royal pride while concealing the true purpose of their proposal. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the councillors and advisers, they claimed in their petition, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. The scope of the claimed consensus was deliberately exaggerated to make opposition seem impossible, while the religious content of the proposed decree was presented as a demonstration of loyalty rather than an attack on religious freedom. By suggesting that all high officials supported this measure, Daniel's enemies made it politically difficult for the king to refuse, without appearing to doubt the judgment of his most trusted advisers. The 30-day limitation was strategically chosen to make the decree seem reasonable and temporary, rather than a permanent assault on religious liberty. Most people could suspend their religious observances for such a brief period without serious spiritual consequences, making compliance appear to be a simple matter of civic duty, rather than a fundamental compromise of conscience. But perhaps most cleverly of all, the proposed decree was framed as an honour to the king rather than a restriction on his subjects. The exclusive right to receive petitions for 30 days was presented as a form of worship that acknowledged Darius's quasi-divine status and special relationship with the forces that governed human affairs. King Darius's acceptance of this proposal revealed both his political naivety and his susceptibility to the kind of flattery that had been the downfall of previous rulers. Therefore King Darius signed the written decree, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how royal authority was manipulated to serve purposes that its wielder did not fully understand. The finality that characterized Persian law once it had received royal approval made the decree particularly dangerous for anyone who might violate its provisions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter, Daniel's enemies had suggested, ensuring that even the king himself would be powerless to modify or rescind the order once it was officially proclaimed. When news of the royal decree reached Daniel, he faced a choice that would test everything he had learned about faithfulness during his long career in imperial service. The options before him were stark and uncompromising. He could suspend his practice of prayer for 30 days and preserve his position and influence within the Persian administration, or he could maintain his religious observances and face certain death in accordance with Persian law. The decision that Daniel made revealed both the depth of his spiritual maturity and his understanding that some things were more important than life itself. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, the court records noted, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. The continuation of Daniel's prayer routine was remarkable not for its defiance of royal authority, but for its complete normalcy in the face of mortal danger. This was not a dramatic gesture designed to create political martyrdom, but simply the natural expression of a faith that had been maintained through decades of challenge and pressure. Daniel prayed as he had always prayed, at the same times and in the same manner, because his relationship with God was more fundamental to his identity than his service to any earthly ruler. The location and manner of Daniel's prayers were themselves significant in their symbolism and their practical implications. The upper room with windows open toward Jerusalem proclaimed his continued identification with the people and promises of Israel, despite his long exile in foreign lands. The 3 daily prayer times reflected the rhythm of worship that had sustained him through every crisis of his remarkable career. But perhaps most significantly of all, Daniel's prayers included thanksgiving as well as petition, revealing a heart that remained grateful to God even in circumstances that threatened immediate destruction. This was faith that had learned to trust divine wisdom regardless of earthly circumstances, confidence that had been tested and proven genuine through decades of faithful service. The surveillance that Daniel's enemies maintained over his activities quickly provided them with the evidence they needed to trigger the legal machinery they had so carefully constructed. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God, they reported to King Darius, their words carrying satisfaction that barely concealed their malicious intent. The confrontation with the king that followed was designed to force Darius to acknowledge that his own decree required Daniel's execution, making royal mercy impossible without undermining the fundamental principle that Persian law could not be altered once it had been established. Did you not sign a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? They asked, their question establishing the legal framework that would make Daniel's destruction inevitable. When the king confirmed that such a decree had indeed been signed and remained in effect according to the unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians, Daniel's enemies moved quickly to apply its provisions to their intended victim. That Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day, they reported, their accusation carefully crafted to emphasize both Daniel's foreign origin and his apparent disrespect for royal authority. The impact of this revelation on King Darius was immediate and devastating. Then the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, the court records noted, documenting how the monarch suddenly understood that he had been manipulated into ordering the execution of his most valuable and trusted advisor. The desperate attempt that Darius made to find some legal loophole that might save Daniel's life revealed both his genuine affection for the Hebrew administrator and his recognition that Daniel's death would be a catastrophic loss for the empire. And he laboured till the going down of the sun to deliver him, the chroniclers recorded, noting how the king who wielded absolute power found himself helpless before the inflexible machinery of his own legal system. But the same conspirators who had engineered this crisis were determined to ensure that their carefully laid plans could not be thwarted by royal second thoughts or legal technicalities. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed," they reminded him, their words carrying implicit threat as well as legal instruction. The execution that followed was conducted with the ceremonial precision that characterized major applications of Persian justice, designed not only to eliminate Daniel, but to serve as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to challenge royal authority. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions, the court records noted, documenting how imperial law could override royal preference when political necessity demanded such action. But the personal anguish that King Darius experienced during Daniel's execution was evident in the words of hope and faith that he spoke even as he was forced to implement the death sentence. "Your God, whom you serve continually," he declared to Daniel as he was being lowered into the lion's den, "he will deliver you." The pagan king's expression of confidence in the God of Israel revealed how deeply Daniel's faithful witness had affected even those who did not share his religious convictions. The sealing of the lion's den with the king's own signet ring and the rings of his lords was designed to ensure that no human intervention could interfere with the execution of Persian justice. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed, the chroniclers recorded. noting how elaborate precautions were taken to guarantee that Daniel's fate would be determined by divine power alone. The night that followed was one of vigil and anguish for King Darius, whose conscience was tormented by his role in destroying the man who had served him so faithfully. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, the court records noted, and no musicians were brought before him. Also, his sleep went from him. But while the king wrestled with guilt and despair in his palace chambers, Daniel was experiencing the most remarkable demonstration of divine protection in his long career of faithful service. The lions that should have torn him apart remained as docile as house cats, their predatory instincts somehow suspended by the same divine power that had once shut the mouths of other wild beasts when God's purposes required such intervention. The transformation that occurred within the lion's den was supernatural in its character and complete in its scope. These were not tame animals that had been trained for entertainment, but wild predators whose nature was to attack and devour any creature that entered their territory. Yet in Daniel's presence, they became as harmless as if they had been carved from stone, their very essence altered by divine intervention. When dawn finally broke and King Darius hurried to the lion's den to learn Daniel's fate, his call into the darkness was filled with desperate hope that somehow the impossible might have occurred. "Daniel, servant of the living God," he cried, his voice carrying across the early morning air, "has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" The response that came from within the den was perhaps the most joyful sound that Darius had ever heard. "O king, live forever!" Daniel called back, his voice strong and clear despite his night among the predators. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." The explanation that Daniel provided for his miraculous preservation was both theological and political, acknowledging divine intervention while simultaneously affirming his loyalty to the Persian crown. The innocence that had protected him was not merely legal but moral, reflecting a character that had maintained its integrity through decades of pressure and temptation. The deliverance that followed was as complete as the original condemnation had been comprehensive. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den, the court records noted, documenting how royal joy replaced royal anguish in the space of a few moments. But Daniel's vindication was accompanied by the swift judgment of those who had engineered his near destruction. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. The chroniclers recorded with stark simplicity, noting how the same lions that had been harmless in Daniel's presence immediately demonstrated their natural ferocity when presented with his accusers. The completeness and immediacy of this divine judgment revealed the supernatural character of Daniel's preservation, while simultaneously demonstrating that God's protection of his servants did not extend to those who opposed them. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den, the court observers noted, documenting how natural law reasserted itself the moment divine intervention was no longer necessary. King Darius's response to this remarkable demonstration of divine power was immediate proclamation throughout his empire that acknowledged the supremacy of Daniel's God and commanded appropriate respect for his authority. "I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel," the royal edict declared, "for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end." The theological confession that Darius made in this decree was remarkable in its scope and accuracy, acknowledging divine attributes that many believers struggle to understand fully. "He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth," the king proclaimed, "who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." The restoration that followed Daniel's miraculous deliverance was complete and permanent, establishing him in a position of influence that would continue throughout the remainder of the Persian period. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, the court chroniclers concluded, noting how faithful service under one administration provided the foundation for continued effectiveness under successive rulers. But perhaps most significantly of all, Daniel's experience in the lion's den had demonstrated once again that faith stands firm even in the jaws of death, that divine power can transform the most hopeless circumstances into opportunities for witness, and that those who trust completely in God's protection will discover that He is able to deliver them from any enemy that might threaten their welfare. The stage was set for the final phase of Daniel's remarkable career, as the aged prophet would receive visions of future events that would reveal God's ultimate purposes for His people and His plans for the end of human history. The final years of Daniel's extraordinary life were marked not by the comfortable retirement that his advanced age and distinguished service might have earned, but by a series of prophetic revelations that lifted his understanding far beyond the immediate concerns of imperial administration into the cosmic purposes that would govern human history until the end of time. The aged statesman who had faithfully served 4 different kings was about to become the recipient of divine visions that would provide the most comprehensive preview of future events ever granted to a human being. These revelations came not as rewards for faithful service, but as preparation for a ministry that would extend far beyond Daniel's own lifetime, providing hope and guidance for God's people through centuries of tribulation and persecution that lay ahead. The man who had demonstrated unwavering faith during his own trials was being equipped to strengthen countless others who would face similar tests in generations yet to come. The visions that began to unfold during the final phase of Daniel's career were unlike anything he had previously experienced, characterized by symbolic imagery and cosmic scope that required supernatural interpretation to understand their true significance. Where his earlier encounters with divine revelation had focused on immediate political crises and the fate of contemporary empires, these new revelations opened windows into the ultimate destiny of human civilization and God's final triumph over all earthly powers. The first of these apocalyptic visions came to Daniel during the first year of Belshazzar's reign, long before the writing on the wall would seal that monarch's fate. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed, the prophet recorded, noting how divine communication came to him through the same medium that had once brought revelation to Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier. But where Nebuchadnezzar's dreams had required interpretation by others, Daniel's visions came with their own supernatural commentary that explained their symbolic meaning while revealing their prophetic significance. This was not merely prediction of future events, but divine revelation that would provide the interpretive framework for understanding how God's purposes would unfold through the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. The vision that unfolded before Daniel's sleeping consciousness was both magnificent and terrifying, beginning with imagery that suggested cosmic upheaval on a scale that dwarfed any earthly catastrophe. Daniel spoke, saying, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea," he recorded, his words capturing both the violence and the supernatural character of what he witnessed. From this churning cosmic ocean emerged creatures that defied natural explanation, beasts whose characteristics combined elements from different species, while possessing attributes that belonged to no earthly animal. "And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other," Daniel continued, his description building toward revelations that would reshape human understanding of how divine sovereignty operated through earthly history. The first beast that emerged from the supernatural sea was like a lion with eagle's wings, a creature that combined the nobility and power of the king of beasts with the soaring majesty of the greatest bird of prey. But as Daniel watched, this magnificent creature underwent a transformation that was both humbling and humanizing. "I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it," he observed, witnessing what appeared to be divine judgment that reduced bestial power to human vulnerability. The second beast was like a bear raised up on one side, holding 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, while a voice commanded it to arise, devour much flesh. This creature represented power that was massive and destructive, but somehow unbalanced, capable of consuming vast quantities of prey, but lacking the nobility and dignity that had characterized its predecessor. The The third beast was like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, a creature that combined the speed and agility of a great cat with supernatural abilities that allowed it to dominate vast territories with unprecedented swiftness. And dominion was given to it, Daniel noted, observing how this beast's authority seemed to extend across multiple regions simultaneously. But it was the 4th beast that truly captured Daniel's attention and filled him with horror at its unprecedented destructive power. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, he recorded, struggling to find words adequate to describe what he had witnessed. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. This final creature possessed a malevolence and destructive capacity that exceeded anything represented by its predecessors, combining the worst characteristics of all previous empires, while adding new dimensions of evil that seemed almost supernatural in their scope and intensity. The iron teeth that devoured everything in their path, and the feet that trampled whatever remained, spoke of power, exercised not for any constructive purpose, but simply for the joy of destruction itself. As Daniel continued to observe this terrifying vision, his attention was drawn to dramatic changes occurring among the 10 horns of the 4th beast. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one coming up among them, he noted, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. This little horn quickly revealed characteristics that were even more disturbing than the beast from which it emerged, and there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words, Daniel recorded, observing how this seemingly minor appendage possessed intelligence and arrogance that exceeded anything displayed by the larger powers that surrounded it. The eyes that saw with human cunning, and the mouth that spoke with divine pretensions, represented the culmination of earthly rebellion against heavenly authority. But even as Daniel watched these earthly powers displaying their temporary dominance, his vision suddenly shifted to reveal the cosmic courtroom where ultimate authority actually resided. I watched till thrones were put in place, he recorded, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. The description that Daniel provided of this heavenly throne room was both beautiful and terrifying, revealing divine majesty that dwarfed any earthly display of power, while simultaneously suggesting judgment that would ultimately account for every abuse of authority that had characterized human history. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him, the prophet continued. Thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. The judgment scene that unfolded before Daniel's amazed eyes was comprehensive in its scope and final in its authority, addressing not only the immediate fate of the boastful little horn, but the ultimate destiny of all earthly powers that had set themselves against divine sovereignty. I watched then, because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, Daniel observed. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. But the most remarkable element of this cosmic courtroom drama was not the destruction of rebellious earthly powers, but the investiture of ultimate authority in someone who appeared before the Ancient of Days with credentials that transcended any earthly kingship. I was watching in the night visions, Daniel recorded with awe, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. The authority that was granted to this mysterious figure exceeded anything that had ever been possessed by earthly rulers, encompassing not only political power, but dominion over the very forces of nature and time itself. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, Daniel continued, that all peoples, nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. The interpretation that Daniel received for this remarkable vision provided the theological framework that would govern Jewish and Christian understanding of history for centuries to come. revealing how apparently random political events were actually manifestations of divine purposes that would ultimately establish God's eternal kingdom on earth. "The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth," the interpreting angel explained, "which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it and break it in pieces." This empire would exceed all previous powers in its scope and destructive capacity, representing the final flowering of human rebellion against divine authority. But even this ultimate earthly power would face divine judgment that would strip away its apparent invincibility and demonstrate the futility of opposing God's purposes. "But the court shall be seated," the angel continued, "and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." The personal impact of these revelations on Daniel was profound and lasting, affecting him both emotionally and physically in ways that reveal the tremendous burden of receiving such comprehensive previews of future events. "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed," he recorded, noting how divine revelation could be overwhelming even for those who had spent decades walking closely with God. But this initial vision was only the beginning of a series of revelations that would provide even more detailed information about the end times and the final triumph of God's kingdom over all earthly powers. In subsequent visions, Daniel would receive specific information about the timing of these events, the role that Israel would play in their fulfillment, and the personal resurrection that awaited all who remained faithful to God through the trials that lay ahead. The vision of the ram and the goat that came to Daniel during the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign provided additional details about the immediate future of the Persian and Greek empires, while the prophecy of the 70 weeks revealed with mathematical precision the timing of the Messiah's coming and the ultimate restoration of Jerusalem. Perhaps most remarkably of all, these later visions included personal promises to Daniel himself about his own destiny beyond death. "But you, go your way till the end," the angel instructed him, "for you shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days." The aged prophet who had faithfully served earthly kings was promised a role in the eternal kingdom that would never pass away. The impact of Daniel's prophetic ministry extended far beyond his own lifetime, providing hope and guidance for Jewish communities throughout centuries of persecution and exile. When Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, Daniel's prophecies helped God's people understand that their suffering was temporary and that divine deliverance was certain. When Roman legions destroyed the Second Temple, Daniel's visions reminded believers that earthly kingdoms would ultimately give way to the eternal kingdom of God. But perhaps most significantly of all, Daniel's prophecies provided the interpretive framework that early Christians used to understand the significance of Jesus Christ's ministry, death, and resurrection. The Son of Man, who appeared before the Ancient of Days in Daniel's vision, became the title that Jesus most frequently used to describe himself, while the eternal kingdom that Daniel foresaw found its fulfillment in the church that Christ established. The influence of Daniel's apocalyptic visions on subsequent Jewish and Christian literature was enormous, providing the symbolic vocabulary and theological concepts that would shape religious thought for centuries. The Book of Revelation, written by the Apostle John centuries later, drew heavily on Danielic imagery, while revealing how the aged prophet's visions found their ultimate fulfillment in Christ's victory over sin, death, and the devil. Daniel's personal character throughout this period of extraordinary revelation remained consistent with the faith and integrity that had marked his entire career in imperial service. Even when receiving visions that revealed cosmic secrets and future events, he maintained the humility and devotion to prayer that had sustained him through every previous crisis. The final scenes of Daniel's life, though not recorded in detail in the biblical text, undoubtedly reflected the same faithfulness that had characterized his entire journey from teenage exile to aged prophet. The man who had refused the king's food as a young captive continued to serve God with unwavering loyalty as an elderly statesman, demonstrating that genuine faith grows stronger rather than weaker with the passage of time. The legacy that Daniel left to future generations was multifaceted and enduring, encompassing both practical wisdom about living faithfully in hostile environments and prophetic insight about God's ultimate purposes for human history. His example of uncompromising integrity in public service inspired countless believers who found themselves serving in governmental positions where their faith might conflict with political expectations. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel's life demonstrated that individual faithfulness could have consequences that extended far beyond personal salvation to influence the destiny of nations and the course of history itself. The teenage captive who had purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's food had become an instrument through which God revealed his sovereignty over all earthly powers and his determination to establish a kingdom that would never be destroyed. The aged prophet who had walked with God through the rise and fall of multiple empires had learned that human kingdoms, no matter how powerful they might appear, were temporary manifestations of divine permission, rather than ultimate expressions of earthly authority. The visions that had been granted to him revealed that history was moving according to divine purposes toward a conclusion that would vindicate every act of faith and demonstrate the ultimate triumph of righteousness over rebellion. As Daniel's remarkable life drew to its close, he could look back on nearly a century of faithful service that had spanned multiple empires and influenced countless lives. From the courts of Babylon to the administrative centers of Persia, from the interpretation of royal dreams to the reception of cosmic visions, his journey had demonstrated that unshakable faith could indeed survive and thrive in any circumstances that divine providence might permit. The story that had begun with the teenage exile's quiet resistance to cultural assimilation had become a testament to the power of unwavering commitment to divine truth in the face of overwhelming pressure to compromise. The visions that had concluded his earthly ministry provided the assurance that his faithfulness had contributed to purposes that extended far beyond his own lifetime, and would find their ultimate fulfillment in the eternal kingdom of the Son of Man. In the end, Daniel's life embodied the truth that would sustain God's people through every subsequent trial and persecution, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, that his dominion is everlasting, and that those who trust in him will find their names written in the book of life, and their inheritance secure in the kingdom that shall never be destroyed. The unshakable faith that had rooted itself in a young man's decision to honour God in small matters had grown into a legacy that would inspire courage and hope until the end of time itself.